Shalom and greetings, VFI news supporters and anyone else watching this video. The big news this week, of course, is the election of Donald J. Trump as the 47th president-elect of the United States. We're also having a big political transition in Israel, but not because we had an election, but because our Prime Minister decided to fire his defense minister in the middle of an active shooting war. Iran is still threatening to attack Israel, but they might have second thoughts. Finally, there was an anti-Semitic pogrom in Amsterdam on Thursday evening just before the anniversary of Kristallnacht. All that and more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was one of the first world leaders to congratulate Trump on his election victory. In a post on social media, Netanyahu called it history's greatest comeback and a new beginning for America and a powerful recommitment to the great alliance between Israel and America. The Republican Jewish Coalition, RJC, which is an American organization that seeks to expand the base of Jewish voters supporting Republican candidates, also had a good election night with several candidates they backed winning. Also notable is that more Jewish voters supported Trump and other Republican candidates than in any previous U.S. national election. The American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, also spent over $100 million supporting various pro-Israel candidates for local, state, and federal offices around the country and saw a large number of them elected. One was California Democrat Adam Schiff, who won the election to replace the deceased Dianne Feinstein as one of California's two senators. We can expect to hear a lot more from him in the years to come. Now, getting back to President-elect Trump, in the run-up to the election, he communicated to Israeli leaders that he'd like the war in Gaza to be wrapped up by the time he takes office on January 20th. Following the election, GOP spokesperson Elizabeth Pipko gave an interview with Israel's Channel 12, declaring that Trump expects Israel to conclude the war by winning it 100%. On that subject, it's also important for me to tell you that this week saw the Biden administration deploying some very serious firepower to this region. That includes 6 of the venerable B-52 Stratofortress strategic bombers. The Pentagon is also sending naval destroyers equipped with air defense systems as well as the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System, THAAD for short, to help defend Israel against incoming missiles and drones. Additional squadrons of F-15, F-16, and F-35 fighters, which can have a defensive as well as an offensive role, have also been dispatched. Now, it must be pointed out that the B-52 bombers have no role in defending against anything. They are a very powerful offensive weapons platform, and my hat is off to Joe Biden for taking the step of sending them, and along with them, a very powerful deterrent message to Iran. This is a good place to make a personal statement of gratitude to President Joe Biden for all the support he has given to Israel over the past 13 months. Historians will probably have a very mixed verdict on Joe Biden, but Israelis won't forget how he came to Israel just a few days after the October 7th massacre to make a very needed show of U.S. support for this country. In the months that followed, he gave Israel tremendous diplomatic, military, and economic support that enabled us to do what we had to do. He took a lot of heat for it from his own party and some of America's allies as well. Now, on top of all that right now, he's getting blamed by a lot of Democrats for the beating they took in this election, which I think is unfair, but that's the way it is in politics sometimes, folks. So, Joey, I doubt you'll see this video, but if you do, please accept my personal thanks and appreciation for all you've done for Israel in this crisis. I think by the time this is over, the people of Iran might be thanking him too, because there is a possibility that if Iran does strike at Israel, it will provide Israel with a good reason to strike back decisively, perhaps with help from these United States forces. This will surely lead to the toppling of the Ayatollah regime which rules in Iran, and that will allow a more moderate and maybe even democratic regime to come to power in that country. This is what the Iranian people have been crying out for many years, as well as we're praying, as they march in the streets against the current regime and sometimes paying with their own lives for it. The regime is very afraid of their own people and spend a lot of time, money, effort, and energy keeping them down. Now, I've mentioned on this broadcast before about the large and rapidly growing underground evangelical church in Iran. These precious brothers and sisters in the Lord are subjected to terrible persecution, as well as the hardships that everyone in Iran suffers from because of the poor economy and international sanctions. Please be in prayer for the Iranian people, and while you're at it, pray for the underground churches and all the other countries in this region, as it's never been a bad idea to pray for the above ground and also rapidly growing body of Messiah here in Israel itself. Now, before we get back into the news, I want to stay on the topic of the body of Messiah in Israel for a moment, because there are many in this body who are in very severe financial distress right now. A large percentage of the Israeli believer community has worked in the tourism industry here in Israel because it's one of the few places where believers have a natural advantage. About 65% of incoming tourists to Israel most years are Christian pilgrims. Obviously, they like to have a believer tour guide if possible, and that's why this is a field of work that so many Israeli believers, including Jews, Arabs, and others, go into. So right now, as you probably know, there are very few tourists coming to Israel, and the economy in general is in very, very bad shape. So please be in urgent prayer for the economy of Israel, even as you continue to pray for the IDF soldiers on the front lines, the hostages, the government leaders, and everyone else here. So if you can do more than pray, please visit our website, visionforisrael.com, and click on the Projects tab. This will give you several ways in which you can partner with us to deliver the things Israelis need the most. Things like the bomb safety shelters, supplies, training, and equipment for medical, fire, and security first response teams, groceries and household items for families under financial stress, and much more. Now, once again, that website is visionforisrael.com, and click on the Projects tab. Now back to the news, and staying on the topic of Iran, government spokesperson Fatima Mohajerani told local media in Iran that, quote, "the U.S. elections are not really our business. Our policies are steady and don't change based on individuals. We made the necessary predictions before, and there will be no change in people's livelihoods." But the Iranian currency, the rial, apparently didn't get that memo. It plummeted in value when the markets opened on Wednesday morning following the election, reaching a rate of 703,000 rials to $1, an all-time record. And this happened before a single U.S. missile or bomb was dropped on Iran. Just the thought about what an incoming Trump administration might do to Iran's nuclear program, not to mention new sanctions on oil exports and other vulnerable parts of Iran's economy, sent the currency exchanges into panic mode. Meanwhile, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Deputy Chief Ali Fadavi declared absurdly that the Zionists do not have the power to confront us and they must wait for our response. Well, friends, as the old Tom Petty song says, the waiting is the hardest part. I must admit it's getting tiresome wondering when Iran will get around to firing its threatened barrages of ballistic missiles, drones, and rockets at us. So Israel and the U.S. might decide to preempt the Iranians. I'm sure there's a way to detect when the Iranian missiles are being prepared to be fired, and that would be the ideal time to hit them. Now, Iran is reported to have sent several launchers and missiles into Iraqi territory because this will decrease the amount of time they need to reach Israel after being fired. They're also more accurate at closer range, and firing them from Iraqi territory gives Iran a thin excuse to say that Israel shouldn't retaliate by hitting Iranian territory again. But the other side of that, of course, is that since they're closer to Israel, they're also easier for Israel to target with airstrikes and possibly even our own ballistic missile arsenal. Now so much for game theory, because it's time to talk about something really awful that isn't theoretical at all. I'm talking, of course, about an anti-Semitic pogrom which took place in the city of Amsterdam last Thursday evening. By now, most of the details are well known, so I won't exhaust you with them. Briefly, an Israeli soccer team, Maccabi Tel Aviv, was in Amsterdam to play Ajax, a team from that city. A few thousand Israelis who were in Amsterdam on vacation or who had made a special trip just to watch the match were leaving the stadium after the game and were met by squads of Arabic-speaking young men who attacked them. The attackers used knives, clubs, and other weapons, causing several injuries, including 5 people who had to go to the hospital, maybe even more. Now, the Dutch police, who had been warned that there was trouble brewing, did a pretty poor job of protecting the Israelis and restoring order. The Israeli government responded by sending passenger airplanes to Amsterdam and helping Israelis who needed to evacuate the city to get to the airport and board these planes. Dutch officials made all the right statements, condemning the pogrom and promising to arrest and prosecute those who had participated. But the fact is, very few arrests were made, and candidly, this shouldn't surprise us at all. The truth is that Holland and many other Western European countries have little capacity and less will to seriously confront their Arab and Muslim populations. Still traumatized from the 2 world wars their grandparents and great-grandparents fought in the first half of the 20th century, Europeans have little appetite for violence, even in self-defense. It's one reason why they're so critical of Israel when we use violence in self-defense, and it's also why they're so craven and cowardly when it even comes to their own domestic security threats. Frankly, I don't think this is the last time something like this will happen, and I advise all Israelis who have business in European cities to be very vigilant, and I also advise all Jews who still live in Europe to make Aliyah as soon as possible, immigrate to the nation of Israel. I know it's a bit of cliche, and some will probably accuse me of being alarmist, but I'm saying it anyway. Now we're coming near to the end of this week's report, but there's one more story I have to tell you about, and that's the big surprise Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced on Tuesday evening, just as the polls were opening in the United States. I'm talking, of course, about the announcement that he was firing our Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. Now, a short word of explanation is in order, as our American viewers are probably not familiar with the parliamentary form of government Israel has. In this parliamentary system, the Prime Minister can appoint anyone he wants to be in his cabinet. The defense minister, for instance, doesn't even have to be an elected member of Knesset, but he usually is. That's because ministerial posts are often given to elected MKs from different parties as a reward for joining the coalition. This sometimes means that the people get appointed to be the minister of this or that with absolutely no qualifications for the job, or even desire to do it. I could tell you some stories about that, but we don't have time at all. In Israel, the post of defense minister is really important, so it is usually going to a very serious individual, usually someone who has at least been a senior general, if not former chief of staff in the IDF. However, the position is still sometimes used as a political football, and many in Israel's media and political class believe that's what's happening now. Gallant had a stormy relationship with Netanyahu and also clashed with the more right-wing members of the coalition. Netanyahu tried to fire him in March of 2023, but a massive protest against this decision by the general public actually succeeded in getting him to change his mind, and thank God he did. But National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who never served one day in the IDF because they didn't want him, and that's a long story of its own, was particularly critical of Gallant, who he often says is not aggressive enough in fighting against Hamas and Hezbollah. Gallant has also taken a stand against the demands from the ultra-Orthodox members of the coalition over the issue of drafting ultra-Orthodox young men into the IDF, which I think they should be drafted. This issue has been around for a long time and it's never been resolved. Many Israelis believe that it can't be put off anymore, and Gallant agreed with them. But Netanyahu wants to put it off, and many feel he has fired Gallant in part so that he'd no longer have to listen to his objections to this. Finally, Gallant and Netanyahu clashed over the best way to release Israeli hostages still being held in Gaza. That's a long and very painful story, but the short version is that Gallant accused Netanyahu of refusing to accept the terms Hamas was demanding in exchange for the hostages, because if he does, Ben-Gvir is threatening to bolt the coalition, and Netanyahu cares more about that than he does about the hostages. Well, I have to also say that I don't believe this war is over with Hamas. We have many soldiers dying and many parents of soldiers who want to continue on to victory, as I agree with them. Now remember that Gallant was a major general in the IDF and in charge of the Southern Command, which dealt with Hamas. In his professional opinion, the IDF can withdraw from Gaza while keeping it under close surveillance, as Hamas is demanding, without endangering Israel's national security. I disagree, though, personally speaking. However, Ben-Gvir is demanding that Hamas be eradicated down to the last man. He is supported in this demand by Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who in his youth served an entire 14 months as an office clerk on an IDF base and once thought himself to be a good choice. Well, like I said, it's a painful and long story, but the upshot is that Gallant has been removed from his position in the middle of an active shooting war for reasons that appear to be at least partially an example of old-fashioned coalition politics. Many Israelis think there's something very wrong with this picture, and I'm not one of them, though. I probably won't be joining the street protests that have started outside the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem elsewhere. But I am concerned and definitely not comfortable with the present situation. So we need to pray for Israel. All of that having been said, Foreign Minister Israel Katz is being moved into the defense portfolio. I'm not sure what his qualifications are, so excuse me, I haven't checked into it. But he is very loyal to Benjamin Netanyahu and can be relied upon to implement whatever decisions he makes based on whatever Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are demanding during this past week. Well, I'm sorry for sounding cynical, friends, and I'm sorry to break the tradition of ending the broadcast with good news, but we started with some good news and we're out of time for this report, so it's going to have to suffice. Until next week, I'm Barry Siegel, and this has been another grand edition of VFI News from Israel. Stay tuned next week for more. God bless you and shalom. Continue to pray for our hostages to be released and pray for the peace of Jerusalem.